Thank you for that. I also want to say, since there are a lot of people on the call, we are going to manage questions in a certain way. For those of you with a keyboard, to the best of your abilities, try and type your questions into the chat function. This will make it easier for us to keep an eye on them. And see when they're coming up and coming in without people talking over each other. If you don't have that capability, don't worry about it. We will be regularly asking the group if you all have any questions. So we'll try and make sure to check in with you early and often about that. So without further ado, we're going to start out with a little presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. Actually, before I do that, there was one question I had for all of you. How many people on this call have not had a chance to look at the community guide to the proposed amendments? Maybe some of you don't know what that is. And this is just to give us a sense of what level of detail would be helpful for us to go into this evening. Who has not had a chance? Okay, I see one hand from Maria. Anybody else? Don't worry. Okay, I see another hand from Betsy. Maybe a couple people. Okay, great. That's really helpful, and we'll try and provide a good amount of background while sort of moving things along. And again, like I said, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat or write them down, and when we ask for questions, we'll be able to get to those. All right, so let's get started. Okay, we're trying something a little new. So you'll see my face superimposed over my PowerPoint here. And for folks who are calling in, I will do my best to vocalize everything that's on screen so you're not missing out on anything. So yeah, just welcome to our community meeting. I think we did all of our welcomes and introductions. I prepared a brief agenda for this evening based on what the key concerns and questions I've been hearing from folks thus far. I don't expect that this covers every concern and question that people have, but I figured that if some folks had called in with these questions or emailed in with these questions and concerns, that it was likely that other people had them too. So I thought we should make sure to address those, and then we'll have a big question and answer session at the end saying, what have we missed? What haven't we had a chance to talk about? What are the topics we really need to cover in depth? And before we get to those key issues, I just want to talk about the planning department's goals for this meeting and what we think are our shared goals, the group shared goals, and also just a little bit about the what and the why and the how of these proposed amendments. All right. So meeting goals. Planning department's goals are fairly straightforward, and the primary one is just to hear your concerns and answer your questions. And then the second is to do our best to prepare everyone to provide informed and constructive comments during this upcoming Planning and Zoning Commission meeting on Thursday, May 13th. This meeting is going to be a public hearing, and we encourage you to participate either in person at the Gallatin County Courthouse or via Zoom. And I will send information for this meeting as part of a follow-up to today's meeting. But we want to have a great discussion then. Some shared goals that I think we have is to develop a shared understanding of the substance and implications of the proposed amendments to the Bozeman Pass zoning regulation, and then work together to address concerns about those amendments, those proposed amendments. So motivation and process. Our general motivation and goals is to standardize how the planning department administers the diverse regulations in place in our 15 citizen-initiated, also known as 101 zoning districts, so that we treat people in different citizen-initiated districts fairly, and we process applications from those districts efficiently, and we help decision makers apply the same standards to requests for things like conditional use permits and variances from people living in all those many different districts. An example of sort of the administrative aspects that vary between citizen-initiated zoning districts include noticing provisions, for example. So if you wanted to get a conditional use permit in Bozeman Pass, you are required to send certified mail to all of the adjacent property owners if you are requesting a major conditional use permit, and regular mail to all of the adjacent property owners if you're requesting a minor conditional use permit. But if you go a little further north and west into Bridger Canyon, the noticing requirements for a conditional use permit are just, you have to send certified mail to everybody within 300 feet of the property boundary of the project site. So it's differences like that that can sort of add up among these 15 different districts and rapidly become a source of confusion. And that's a big part of what we are trying to standardize. So how did we get to this point? What even are the part ones, part one administrative zoning regulations? How did they get developed, and how did we reach this point where we're talking to you all? So the creation and the adoption of the part one zoning administrative regulations started in December 2018 and went through May 2019. And like I said, it was, and Sean, jump in here if you want to add anything. The goal was to sort of decrease confusion about all these different administrative processes in place for the 15 citizen-initiated zoning districts in the county. And a draft of these regulations were released during a public hearing, and then we reached out to different groups for comment. Some of our citizen-initiated zoning districts have special citizen zoning advisory committees, and they can sometimes serve as our sort of point people for changes like this. You know, we let them know that that's happening, and they help spread the word in the community and sort of concentrate and collect feedback. So we reached out to those that exist and some other sort of informal groups like the Bridger Canyon Properties Owner Association for feedback. Then we had 2 public workshops and 2 public hearings, and then those got adopted in May 2019. And then when the part one zoning administrative regulations get adopted, they don't automatically apply to all of our citizen initiated zoning districts. So we have to go to each one of those 15 districts and say, hey, we are interested in adopting into your regulation these administrative regulations. And so there's a separate process for each district for that. And so that's how we ended up approaching Bozeman Pass. And that began with a letter from my colleague in December 2020 to 6 of the 9 Bozeman Pass Advisory Committee members saying, hey, this is something we're considering. I think he also included a copy of the proposed amendments or the part one zoning administrative regulation. And then since then, there was a public hearing before the Planning and Zoning Commission in March, at which they thought, you know, we haven't heard a lot of comment from people in Bozeman Pass on this. I think we need more time to hear from them. And so subsequent to that, we've been trying to increase our outreach efforts and get the word out. And we've started hearing from more and more people. There had been a Planning and Zoning Commission meeting scheduled to discuss the proposed amendments to Bozeman Pass in April. And because of what we are hearing from folks in the district, that was what's known as continued to a date certain. So it said, you know, we're not ready to address this. People need more time to understand these regulations. We're going to talk about it in May at our meeting. So that brings you to this point. We thought a community meeting, informal, no decision making's happening, we're just talking, would be a really helpful step in sort of getting the conversation going and getting everybody on the same page. Just a note, we have had this question from folks, you know, if you are unhappy with the decision made by either the Planning and Zoning Commission or the County Commission about this, you can appeal to the Gallatin County District Court within 30 days of the decision. So we did get a question about this, and I just want to highlight that too. All right, any questions about motivation and process? It looks like we got a question from Mark. So are you in the process of amending the zoning regs of the other 14 citizen-initiated districts also? Yeah, great question, Mark. So let's see, I think 12 of the other citizen-initiated zoning districts have already adopted the Part 1 zoning administrative regulations into their regulations. The 3 remaining are Bozeman Pass, Spring Hill, and Bridger Canyon. And it looks like Quincy has his hand up. I just want to note, we're going to try and get through these agenda items with sort of basic questions first. And then if we want to dive in deeper detail into any of these topics, I think we can do them during the open question and answer session. Quincy, do you?
Well, I had a question about participation. On the when we were adopting the decision to make these administrative, was there anybody from Bozeman Pass that showed up from that? And then another question similar to this is, what was the participation level on the other 12 zoning districts when these were adopted? That's all.
Sean will answer that one.
I can take that. So we did provide public notice of the various work sessions that were held by the Planning and Zoning Commission for that process of discussion and adoption of the administrative regulations. There wasn't much in the way of public participation or interest, it seemed at the time. The most participation came from those districts that have the citizens advisory committees. They were more engaged and provided comment, as well as Bridger Canyon, which doesn't have a formal citizens advisory committee, but had a working group that was working on some comprehensive amendments to their regulations. And so they were engaged in that process, but there wasn't a lot of public interest or public comment in general on that process, despite us providing multiple mechanisms of notice. It was noticed on the website. I think we did some blasts on social media, as well as the traditional notice in the newspapers.
And
okay, before you go on, I want to follow up on that question with Sean. It's Wynn Jessup on Laurel Ranch Road. Okay, you said that there were 12 of the citizen-initiated zoning districts that have already approved this at phase 1 administrative. Is that correct?
The county commission has finalized
meetings.
the
Where
text amendments.
at the dates of those meetings and whether they were recorded so we can listen to what the questions were of those people?
You can listen to the audio recording from the Planning and Zoning Commission hearings. Those are accessible on our website.
Where on the website? I've looked for them.
here, we can, I think that's a great question, Randy. And let's talk about this. We can circle back to this in our open Q&A. I think we want to, there's a longer conversation we want to have about noticing potentially. And we can talk about where you can find that information. Sound good?
Yeah, that'll be fine. Thank you.
Okay, great, lovely. And it looks like we had a couple more questions come in on chat. One is from Jonathan. You state that we are invited to make comments at the May 13th meeting. Will our comments be incorporated into the proposal, or will a decision as written still be made that day? So a great example, that's a great question, Jonathan. A great example is what happened at our most recent April Planning and Zoning Commission meeting with members of the or residents of the Spring Hill zoning district. And they came forth and shared a lot of comment. And Sean and I got some direction from the Planning and Zoning Commission based on all the comment and feedback we heard from folks in Spring Hill about modifications to both the Part 1 administrative regulation and potentially the Spring Hill regulation based on those comments. And I'll actually show an example of that modification here in just one moment. Excellent. It looks like Sean shared where you can access the agendas and recordings from past Planning and Zoning Commission online in the chat. There was also another quick question from Dana Reinard. So to clarify, there was no one from Bozeman past present. I think you mean during the process for the adoption of the Part 1 zoning administrative regulations. I think that's how I'm understanding that question. Is that correct?
I don't recall anyone from Bozeman Pass providing comment during that process.
Okay. All right. I'm going to move into key concerns, and this will provide an example of, how we integrate feedback from folks into the regulation. So I hope everybody can see this clearly. A key concern that I heard in talking to people initially was sort of the continuance of the district as, its independent entity is Bozeman Pass, and having its own development pattern and own intent and own purpose. And I heard from some of you some concerns about current language in the administrative regulation. I cited this section here at section 1.3, which reads, upon the county commission's adoption of this administrative regulation for a zoning district, this administrative regulation supplements the district regulation. In case of a conflict between this administrative regulation and a district regulation, this administrative regulation shall control. And folks had some concerns about that. And actually, we heard concerns about this language from folks in other districts too at the last Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. And so Sean and I worked on some supplemental language. It looks like I might be in the way here, but I will read it aloud. So picking up from, let's see, in the case of a conflict, between this administrative regulation and a district regulation, this administrative regulation shall control only as it pertains to administrative procedure. The administrative regulation shall not be interpreted as modifying the purposes, intents, or development patterns of district regulations. So that's one of the ways that the planning department can respond to your feedback. And, we hear that there are concerns about this, and we want to make sure it's clear, what this regulation is trying to do. It looks like we got another question in the chat. Why did the planning department not send letters and knock on our doors? The vast majority of us just found out about this, and the assumption that we are following Bozeman Planning Department on social media is absurd. Yeah, I certainly don't expect you to follow Bozeman Planning Department on social media. This is a great question, and we are going to talk about noticing during our open Q&A session. So I really want to address this question, and I think it's really important, but can we table that, Matthew, for just a few more minutes? Sorry, I can't see everybody's faces. I see, okay, great. I see a thumbs up. Thanks, Matthew. Great. All right. Okay, I see no questions. So I'm going to go to the next sort of key concern that I've been hearing from folks, which has to do with natural resources. And so there were all kinds of questions about this. And one of the most basic ones was, is any kind of natural resource extraction permitted in Bozeman Pass? And the answer is yes. And the following uses bulleted in the screen are currently allowed with an approved natural resources conditional use permit in each of Bozeman Pass's 3 existing subdistricts. There have been no proposed change to this. And so for those of you calling in or just listening without a video, those uses are coal bed methane exploration and development, commercial quarries greater than 5 acres in size, mining, both surface and underground, and oil and gas exploration and development. So that will not change. There was an unintentional removal of criteria 5 from the National Natural Resource Conditional Use Permits section. We think that was done in error. The criteria is that adequate financial security as determined by the Gallatin County Attorney has been provided to mitigate any such adverse effects. So Sean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I do not think that the planning department wants to delete this provision.
Correct. That will be going back in for the draft that, any draft that moves forward.
Great. Okay, any sort of general or any sort of very specific questions about natural resources in Bozeman Pass? Looks like Quincy's got his hand up, and we've got a question from Tim and Penny Roberts. Quincy, I'll get to you in just one moment. Tim and Penny Roberts say, we have been hearing that this could potentially affect personal wells. I don't think I understand that. Tim and Penny, do you want to unmute yourself and talk a little bit more about that?
Sorry. Yeah, we had just been hearing the potential that, I'm so sorry, that under the guise of all of these, the coal bed methane and all that other stuff, that it could be potentially worked in that we would have issues with our own personal wells and having some regulations put upon us and our wells.
Oh, I see. So it sounds like your question is a concern about if somebody engaged in, coal bed methane exploration and development, that would then result in a regulation of your well.
Potentially.
I see. I
think that's one of the purposes of the review process, the conditional use permit process for any of these natural resource extraction type uses, is to review the proposed use, identify potential impacts, and require mitigation of those impacts. So yes, some of these uses could potentially have an adverse effect on water quality. And a goal of the review process would be to identify that and determine what sort of mitigation would be appropriate to reduce, or hopefully in the case of water quality impacts, alleviate that risk. But the changes that are being discussed in terms of incorporating the administrative regulations don't modify the review process for these kinds of uses in the district.
So, because my understanding is that there are some other states who are beginning to tax, et cetera, private wells. And I didn't know if this was a potential issue of having this natural resource extraction, any of this being put in that situation.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with individual water wells being taxed, but that would be something that's well beyond the scope of a zoning regulation. That would be something that's being done through state tax code.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Penny. Quincy, you had a question?
Yeah, just real briefly, have there been any conditional use permit applications in the last 15 years for natural resource extraction? And if so, what came of them?
I don't believe there have been.
Mission accomplished.
All right. Let's see, Matthew put another question into the chat. Does the administrative process dispute resolution supersede existing HOA CC&Rs legally filed against existing properties? I'm not sure I entirely understand that question. Sean?
Yeah, I think the question is saying, you have the zoning regulations, you have covenants that are filed through an HOA. What do you have to follow? And the answer is you have to follow the most restrictive regulation. So, sometimes the county through the subdivision review process puts county required covenants within a subdivision. And then, going on down the road a few years, maybe zoning came in and those two things don't necessarily line up perfectly. You need to follow the more restrictive requirement. So in another sense, maybe a zoning regulation calls for a 20-foot setback from a property line, and covenants that exist on that property call for a 50-foot setback. In that example, you would need to adhere to the 50-foot setback. Those are just totally hypothetical examples, but.
All right, I'm not seeing any additional questions, so I'll go on to the next sort of key concern that I've been hearing, which had to do with agriculture and the existing Part 1 zoning administrative regulation includes pulls in the definition of agriculture from Montana Code Annotated. And we've been hearing a lot of discussion in some other districts about this. The questions from this district were pretty specific. One of them had to do with why is marijuana called out in the Part 1 zoning administrative regulation as being sort of different from agriculture. And it's basically just because, unlike wheat or corn grown for distilling, the plant requires no processing to be considered a controlled substance. And then the sort of follow-up question was, well, what about hemp? Hemp is looked on differently than marijuana. Commercial cultivation, growing, and harvesting of hemp and hemp seeds are considered agricultural activities. So just to make that explicit. As far as why we would be modifying the definition of agriculture and including it in the Part 1 zoning administrative regulation, the planning department spends a lot of time trying to interpret what is and what isn't agriculture, because we are concerned with the proliferation of structures that would not otherwise be allowed by the district regulation. So someone will come in and they say, I like to go on hunting trips. I have all these taxidermied animals. I want to build sort of a mini lodge for me and my friends and put these taxidermied animals up. And I want to have a bar in it. And, it'll be sort of a rec room, but this is agricultural, right? Because it has animals in it. And so then we go through a process of discussing whether or not it is in fact agricultural. And, basically that is confusing for people who are thinking, well, maybe my project is agricultural. And it also eats up a lot of our staff time. And as a staff of 9, there's not a whole lot of that. So we actually, this is another example of how the planning department can respond to and digest what we hear in public meetings and hear in meetings like this and hear when you send us an email, is we realize that, we're not necessarily interested in regulating the activity of agriculture. We're concerned about agricultural structures, right? Because we're concerned about the proliferation of all these structures that otherwise wouldn't be allowed. And so we're actually currently working with the residents of the Spring Hill zoning district on how to address this in a manner that doesn't, infringe upon collaborative agricultural lifeways and practices that they have developed over there and that we hear are, pretty common throughout the valley. So if this is something that's of interest to you, we encourage you to get involved, especially if you have some ideas. Sean?
Yeah, just to jump in real quick. So what Catherine touched on there is most of our zoning regulations have special considerations for agricultural structures. Um, They often allow them to exceed any height limitations. It's pretty common for setbacks not to apply to agricultural structures. Um, Maybe a district has a limitation on the size of an accessory building. So if you just want to build a shop for hobby purposes, maybe there's a size limitation that it can be. Agricultural structures are often exempt from those kinds of things. So we unfortunately have people who are trying to call something agricultural structure, an agricultural structure that is not legitimately tied to an agricultural use, or that the primary purpose of that structure is not related to agriculture. And so we'd really like to, in the administrative regulations, have a process that's clear and predictable for us, that we can point to, that helps provide, guidance. That predictability and clarity should be beneficial to people who are applying for permits as well, or wanting to understand the rules better. So.
Thanks, Sean. That was really helpful. I am not seeing any questions about this. Oh, Quincy, it looks like you've got your hand up. Go right ahead. Oh, and it looks like Tim and Penny Roberts also have a question. We'll get to you next. Thanks.
Just real briefly, this came up at the last planning department meeting that I was at in March, and I've been thinking about it, and I was wondering, my understanding is that this restriction regarding the marijuana thing was an instruction to the planning department from the county commissioners. But that was obviously prior to the last election, where marijuana was essentially legalized. And so, I just am putting in my 2 cents worth here, that there might be a legal issue here, that by identifying marijuana as a prohibited agricultural activity, you're countering state law. I totally get it, why you guys are doing this, but I'm not sure that it is relevant anymore. That's all, just a comment.
And yeah, Quincy, you were at the meeting in April where I gave the explanation, because one of the commissioners asked, how did this end up in the definition of agriculture? What had happened, we had someone purchase a residential property in a neighborhood, in a pretty dense neighborhood, like half-acre lots, and come in and basically gut the house and gut the garage, and completely turn both of those structures into a grow facility for a medical marijuana business. And one of the neighbors complained and said, "Hey, is this kind of use allowed in our neighborhood under the zoning?" And said, "No, we don't think it is. This is really an industrial kind of use in a residential neighborhood." And the proprietor of the establishment tried to say that they were exempt from any regulation, because the growing of the medical marijuana was in fact an agricultural activity. And so we worked with the county attorney's office, and the result was the definition that is currently in the administrative regulations pertaining to agriculture, which the county attorney's office has continued to be involved in this process, and I appreciate Quincy kind of posing the question about whether it's still legal, given what is it, I-190, I think. The county attorney's office hasn't expressed a concern about any legal conflict so far, but a good question to ponder for sure.
Yeah, thank you. It looks like, okay, Tim and Penny Roberts had a question, and somebody was piggybacking on their question, so I'll read both. Let's see. I am in the process of building a root cellar and maybe a greenhouse. Why would that be a conditional use permit? Melvin Anderson. Okay, and then to piggyback on the Roberts question, I need to build a hay shed. At the moment, I'm not required to get a permit for that. Does this change things? This is a great question. And I am not sure whether, in response to the first question about the root cellar, I'm not sure that that would require a conditional use permit.
If you want to keep going, Catherine, I can look up the zoning regulations real quick and report back when we take the next break.
Okay, great. That would be very helpful. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, he's going to look at the zoning regulations and see what's required there. And we'll loop back to that. But I think this is a nice segue into our next and final sort of key topic of concern, which is land use permits with these proposed amendments. So land use permits would be required for new structures and structural alterations in the district with the adoption of the proposed amendments that incorporate the Part 1 zoning administrative regulation. Currently, land use permits are not required for what's known as of right or accessory structures. So an as of right structure would be like a single family dwelling, like your one single family dwelling per, whatever your allowed density is in your sub-district. Part of the reason why the planning department has land use permits is because it's our primary way of ensuring that new development complies with the zoning regulations and has access to required basic services like septic permits. We don't issue those, but it's a sort of an extra layer of just checking to make sure folks have those if they're necessary. Bozeman Pass doesn't have a lot of standards, like they have 0 lot line setbacks except in certain circumstances, and there are no height restrictions in your district. But you all do have general development standards that include setbacks from perennial streams and wildfire mitigation. And so things of that nature where it's like about, protecting a water supply or protecting you all from the risk of wildfire. That's where that comes into play. And those standards are already in your regulation, and the land use permit is a process that sort of checks that. So some people have asked, land use permit, what they cost. They currently cost either $275 or 1/4% of the market value of the structure being built, whichever is greater. The planning department's fee schedule, however, may be updated at the May 13th Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. So land use permit fees may change. Sean might have some more information on that, I'm not sure. Also, just to be clear, land use permits are different from things like conditional use permits and variance requests because no public hearings are required and no public notices are required. It's what we call an administrative process. Again, it's just, have you met the standards of the zoning regulation? Typically, it takes 2 to 4 weeks after submittal to get the permit approved, depending upon whether we're in the super busy summer season or in a quieter winter time. Some folks have asked if land use permits expire with the Part 1 zoning administrative regulation. If you haven't completed all the exterior construction on your structure within 2 years, your land use permit will expire. However, the inside of your structure can, be in whatever state of completion you desire. I point this out because some folks called in with concerns about Section 9 of the administrative regulation, which talks about zoning improvements agreements and has regulations associated with those. And basically, they only come into play if you don't complete exterior construction on your structure within 2 years of land use permit approval or change of use permit approval. So it only applies in those circumstances. And it's as I understand it, and Sean, you can correct me, it's sort of an incentive mechanism to help move folks along through their projects. So let's see. Just to also be clear, land use permits wouldn't be required retroactively. So for existing structures, you wouldn't have to come in and get a permit for your current house. If you did add an addition to it, you likely would. Also, if you're in the middle of a construction project, whenever any proposed amendments are adopted, and those proposed amendments include land use permit requirements for whatever you're building, if you've already poured your foundation, it's unlikely that we'll ask you to come back in and get a land use permit. Am I correct in that, Sean?
Yeah. And this is related to one of the questions about, grandfathered uses and structures. So we look at the date that actual construction started on the project, and anything that actual construction has started on, would not be subject to a land use permit if the commission does adopt land use permits for Bozeman Pass. And the related question about kind of grandfathered uses or structures, we're not removing those provisions. We're simply taking those provisions and other administrative provisions out of the body of the Bozeman Pass zoning district regulation, and they're now found in the standalone set of administrative regulations that just standardizes those provisions across our 15 zoning districts. So there are still there's still a possibility and processes that people can go through to have a structure or a use that predated the zoning regulations and no longer would be allowed, recognized as the kind of common term as a grandfathered use or structure. We call it a legal non-conforming use or structure. Those rights are protected.
Yeah, and if you want to at home, it's non-conforming parcels, uses, signs, and structures are all covered in the Part 1 zoning administrative regulation. So it addresses all of those about, how we handle them and that they exist and that kind of thing. So we're not just dispatching with that. And it looks like Matthew had a great question. How is the value of a structure determined under the proposed additional land use permitting process?
So we asked the owner, the applicant, to provide an estimate of the value of the structure. We're looking at the market value of the proposed improvement to the property. And we kind of have some parameters that we use. And if we feel like someone is reporting a value that's unreasonably low, we ask them to provide a breakdown of how they've come up with that estimate. And, in some instances, we've asked for additional documentation, but most people are pretty fair with those estimates, and it's a pretty common thing we deal with in our office.
Right. Any additional questions about land use permits? Not seeing any hands up, or
I think Quincy's got his hand up.
sorry, I was clicking through the list of folks. Quincy, go ahead. Thanks.
Hi. First, I'd like to make a little comment. I'm not sure how many people that are on this call were part of the original process, which took almost 3 years to create this zoning district. But the zoning district was not exactly universally popular. In fact, it failed in its first attempt. And the reason that we eventually decided to do it had to do with the natural resource aspect, because people were, reasonably concerned about having an oil well or a gas well in their backyard. And so the compromise was that the Bozeman Pass would retain the same simplicity of land use as the rest of the county had for those uses that were considered allowed by right. And so now what we're hearing from the planning department is that calling it an administrative change, this is a major structural change. This cuts right to the intent of the Bozeman Pass zoning district by requiring land use permits for uses allowed by right and accessory uses. And I think that this is not an administrative thing. This is very clearly a structural aspect of this. And I would say it's right at the essence of our unique zoning district. And many people live here. We do not expect land use permits, and many people purchase property here just because of the lack of land use permits. And so I'm just speaking here strictly for myself, but I would like to hear from everyone that's on this call if you agree. I feel betrayed. So I'd like to hear a comment from it.
Well, before we do that, because I don't think we're ready to open this up to kind of broad discussion at this point. We are still trying to get through the presentation and just go through issues of clarification, or answer questions of clarification. But the land use permit issue is, we definitely recognized this was different than the issues with adopting administrative regulations in the other districts. We did have the Planning and Zoning Commission consider a separate resolution of intent that dealt with this specifically, and recognizing that it was a bigger issue. That was why we reached out to all of the people that were on the original committee for Bozeman Pass that we could find addresses or contact information for. So we certainly recognize, this is a bigger deal for Bozeman Pass than, taking the land use permit section out of another district regulation and putting it in the administrative regulation. It's very much a conversation. It's not a mandate coming from the county. We have struggled with administering some aspects of this regulation without the land use permit. And we've had situations where people have started construction only to find out they weren't meeting a water course setback, which is still required, and having to go through after the fact variances or moving structures and things like that. So we've certainly had some challenges, but the county is not, nor is the planning department, mandating that this provision be included in your district. It's a conversation. So once we get to the point where we're ready to open that up, I do anticipate that will be one of the more popular topics people want to discuss this evening, and that's great. It's great to see so many of you here and interested in the conversation. So
excellent. Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Quincy, for bringing that up. And I have written that down, and that's in our list of things to discuss in just a moment. In the meantime, Mark had a very quick question. He says, in the glossary, is there a definition of structural alterations? And yes, Mark, there is. In the Part 1 zoning administrative regulation, section 2.21, there's a definition of structural alteration, which is a change in the shape or size of a portion of an existing structure or of the supporting members of an existing structure that increases the exterior dimension of the existing structure, including, but not limited to, walls, columns, beams, arches, girders, foundation, floor joists, or roof joists. And so I think a key component of this is it's increasing the exterior dimension of the existing structure. Is that helpful? Okay, great. You're very welcome. And we also got a comment from a Michael who said, totally agree with what Quincy just said. And I'll just reiterate what Sean said. Yeah, we will get into that more in just a moment here. So any more sort of discrete questions about land use permits or things related to some of these specifics?
I did just want to circle back on the questions that were asked about, building a greenhouse and a hay shed kind of thing. Under the existing Bozeman Pass zoning regulations, those are both uses allowed by right. Under the, and there's a definition of agricultural land in the Bozeman Pass zoning district that refers to some of the same statutes that are referenced in the might actually even be a little bit more stringent what's in there in Bozeman Pass, but refers to some of the same statutes that are in the administrative regulation. But with the amendments and the incorporation of the administrative regulations, agricultural structures are based on agricultural land classification. So I think we're ending up at the same place. What is potentially different with the administrative regulation adopted is, going through and identifying what uses require a land use permit then or not, whether agricultural structures would still be exempt from it.
Great. Did that clarify? Okay, looks like Tim and Penny have another question. With the land use permits, I understand that when there is a checking on this, they would have the okay to beacon buildings to see if they are covered appropriately. Sorry. Penny, could you elaborate a little bit?
Sorry, I was trying to figure out where to unmute.
No problem.
Yeah, I'm not typing it in as fast as I'm thinking it, so I apologize. No, my understanding is that the potential of if there is any certification, that they have to come up and check for a land use permit to make sure that everything's the way it should be, that then gives them the right to check all other buildings on the property to make sure that they are following the same guidelines. Is that correct?
To some extent, I say that's partially true. If you are applying for a land use permit for a new residence, and we go out there to do the inspection for that residence and see that you're also building a detached garage, or maybe just completed building a detached garage that would have required a land use permit and you didn't apply for it, yeah, we're going to take note of that and require you to get the permit for it. If we're going out there on a property that's got lots of old structures on it that predate zoning very obviously, the focus of our review is, as it usually is, on what you're applying for at the time. So there are situations where we do get derailed with people who are building other things at the same time that they didn't apply for the permits for, but it's not that common.
Yeah. Okay.
Catherine, I'm going to go back to Sean's explanation on the structures. You guys used several times an example of a greenhouse, and I just want to get clarification here. If I decided to build a greenhouse on my property, buy the materials and build that, you're saying I would have to get a land use permit. But if I decide to go to Norris and buy one off the lot there and have it put on my property, I don't have to get a land use permit because I'm not building anything. Is that correct? Or am I incorrect?
So the distinction you're making, let's ignore the greenhouse for a moment. If you're making a distinction between constructing a structure on your property versus placing a pre-built structure on your property.
Correct.
That does not impact permitting. If the structure is subject to a permitting requirement, that permitting requirement would be the same whether you're building it on site or moving a pre-built structure in.
So I got to get a permit to buy and put an 8x10 or 12-foot greenhouse on my property and bring it in.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you made the distinction about a pre-built structure versus one you're building on site, and that's not a distinction that the regulations recognize. It's the end structure. Does that structure require a permit or does it not? And so right now under the Bozeman Pass zoning regulations, the agriculture structures they don't require a permit. I'm trying to bring the regulations back up on my computer. Bear with me a second. The construction and maintenance of barns, corrals, and other agricultural buildings and structures accessory to agricultural uses are uses allowed by right. No land use permits are required. Under accessory uses, there's provisions right now for incidental uses customarily and necessarily related to rural residential. So right now that covers something like a greenhouse, whether it's,
Right.
you know, if it's not technically agricultural, whether it's 8 by 10, 10 by 20, whatever, there's not a size limitation on that.
So I can go get one under these regulations and don't have to get any kind of permit.
Under the current regulations, that is accurate.
Yeah, what about the new ones,
The proposed ones.
the proposed ones?
Let me look at that a little bit
I mean,
closer.
you're telling me if I have to do that, I go out and buy something, then I have to come to you and pay 1/4 or 1% for what I just paid for this structure to put it on my property? That's preposterous.
So Sean's going to check the administrative regulation,
So,
see what it says about those kinds of situations and greenhouses.
How to unmute it to talk.
Oh. I want to just go through a couple comments that have come in the chat so we can hear all of them. Let's see. Jeffrey Peters says, I also agree with Quincy. If the permit process becomes too onerous, folks are likely to not get them at all and just build what they want without even involving the county. And then let's see, somebody asked, can you please expand on why Gallatin County would take on additional responsibilities, as well as where do the fees go, i.e. distributed related to the actual permit? I see. So I think that question is sort of what is the purpose of land use permitting? Am I understanding that correctly? Feel free to chime in if this was your question.
Quincy's right on the money. This is about structures, not straight.
Okay. I'm not seeing or hearing from that person, but I think that's the intent of that question. And I think, like we said, and like Sean explained, land use permits are the primary means that we have to make sure that when people have started building and placing structures on their property, that it's happening in compliance with the existing zoning regulations. And like Sean said, you know, we wouldn't know whether or not somebody is following the perennial stream setback that you all adopted in your zoning regulation otherwise. And if that comes to light later, then basically that person has to go through a more expensive and more onerous process. So Sean mentioned variances. And so, you know, if you realize that you have accidentally built your structure in a within a perennial stream setback, then, you know, in order to rectify that, you would have to request a variance from the Planning and Zoning Commission, and that involves a fee and a public hearing and noticing to your neighbors. And so this is a, you know, a lower cost, typically lower, just less intense way to, you know, ensure that, you know, before people break ground or, you know, pour a pad for whatever structure they have planned, that it already meets the requirements and they won't have to come back in later. Or that, you know, if you pass your property along to your children, then they won't inherit that problem. And as for where the land use permitting fees go, that is a question for Sean. I do not know the answer to that.
So kind of circling back, one of the questions about non-agricultural structures like a storage shed, et cetera. And it makes sense why it's not in the regulation, since land use permits weren't initially contemplated. But it's very common for, in say the general development standards section of a regulation, for there to be a section on accessory structures and to say, structures less than a certain square footage don't require land use permits. And so that's not in here right now or in the proposed update, but it's something that if there is movement forward on the land use permit, is something that would be advisable to put in. And that would address the comment about, buying a small pre-built structure or a storage shed, whether it's agricultural or not. So in terms of where fees go into the county's general fund. And then they are distributed as part of the county's budget process. So they don't go directly to the planning department. Their checks are made out to the county treasurer, and they go into the county's general fund. And the purpose of those land use permits, again, is to administer ensure that what is happening in the districts adheres to the standards that have been adopted. So
did that answer everybody's question? Did you have any questions about Sean's comment about?
Sean, can I make one more comment? And I don't want to belabor this meeting because it's going on a pretty good time. But I would just make a suggestion, and I'm doing this tongue in cheek, but I'm also serious. If you're going to start collecting fees on some of these things that have not been done in the past, you might put it into a special fund to better notify people in the areas where you're going to make these changes. Because putting 3 8x10 or whatever notices on telephone poles in an area as large as the Bozeman Pass zoning district is just not adequate. I know that meets the standards, but maybe someday people will realize there's a better way to do it. And maybe start putting some of these funds so you can call people or send letters to them. Under your government things, you don't have to pay 52 or 54 cents.
And I'm so glad that you brought that up, and that might be a really great segue into our conversation about noticing. We did get one more discrete question that I noticed in the chat about how many issues has the county had with non-conforming structures in the Bozeman Pass district. But I also saw some comments just to acknowledge them. And again, apologies if I'm missing these. I'm trying to keep track. Another comment said, please ask Sean to look up non-agricultural structures as well, i.e. simple gear storage shed. Would those require land use permits under new proposed administrative regulations? And so I think Sean's previous comment about the existence of exemptions for land use permits for structures under a certain size, like I think in Big Sky, the threshold is 300 square feet. Anything below that size is exempt from land use permitting requirements. So that's just one example of a regulation that's in place in the county and another citizen initiated district. But yeah, so that could be an option if there is interest in moving forward with having any land use permits. And let's see, other comments. So people just said yes in response to the comment we heard about noticing, and use executive services for Ellis Fire uses them. I am not sure what executive services is, but I think it might be like a emergency text notification system. Is that correct?
No, they're the same mailing service the county uses to send out mailers, yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. So it sounds like we are using them. And then I see a comment that says, agree, this is BS. So it sounds like there are two key issues for us to continue to discuss right now. And those are noticing and more discussion sort of land use permits and sort of more Q&A about that. Before we transition into a discussion about either one of those, I just want to check in with the group because, I set this agenda based on what I had been hearing from people thus far. And I want to make sure that we didn't miss some big aspect of this that needs to be addressed in some way. Are there other concerns that we haven't talked about yet that we should also discuss when we have sort of this broader discussion coming up next? Let's see.
I think there are a lot of concerns
Oh, go ahead.
with just a lot of, this is Nona on Chestnut, just a lot of concerns about density and, I guess just concerns about the county's ability to change our regulation going forward if there was some desire for developments, and what process would they have to go through then to amend the regulation again to change our density pattern?
Okay, thanks. That's helpful, Nona. So it sounds like the concern has to do with how zoning regulations get amended and what that process looks like. And then a more specific concern about like whether densities could be changed in the district. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as far as densities are concerned, the proposed amendments are not proposing any changes to densities in the Bozeman Pass zoning district. That is part of what we understand to be sort of the intent and purpose of the district and critical to, the development pattern up there. That is not something that we are interested in changing at all. And as for, let's see, okay, I'm getting some comments. Density is a major concern from everyone I have spoken with. Great, thank you, Matthew. And there are many deletions in the whole Bozeman Pass zoning regulations. However, some of old section 4 on pages 28 through 31 have been deleted. This includes rules on variances, amendments, complaints, and enforcement. Why have these been deleted and why have they been moved to, or were they all completely deleted? And to narrow it down a little bit, the district is broken into 40 acres and 80 acres. And then there's that public lands district, right, with a very, very low density. Yep. Okay, so as for the deletions, we will get to that shortly, but I want to stick with the density question. So like I said, we have no interest in modifying the density. If someone were to propose that, either the county or a member of the public, they would have to go through a zone text amendment process that sort of follows the process that we're undergoing here, except the community meeting, like this specific type of community meeting that we're having right now, is not statutorily required. Sean, I haven't been through a zone text amendment process in full yet. Do you want to jump in and describe that a little for us?
Sure. So the zone text amendment, someone submits an application to change the text of the zoning regulation. It gets publicly noticed, and there's then public hearings before the Planning and Zoning Commission and the County Commission. And I know there's some interest from the comments in the chat about the adequacy of notice, and I'm glad that's coming up because that's actually something we're wanting to talk to the Planning and Zoning Commission about. I think we have that on their schedule in June to kind of identify ways to expand notice, and we have some ideas on that. With respect to the process that's unfolded here, while the notice might not have been ideal, I do want to give the example of how one voice makes a difference. We had one member of the public write a letter to the Planning and Zoning Commission saying more public involvement and public input is necessary in this process. The Planning and Zoning Commission agreed to delay the hearing on that, and they've now agreed to delay it further. And as a result, all of this has unfolded, and it's, I won't say culminated because it's not done yet, but it's resulted in everyone being here tonight and participating in this discussion. So, the power of one voice does have quite an impact.
Did that answer your question, Nona?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Great. So there are a couple, Quincy, I see your hand up. Is it related to Nona's question? It is? Okay, go right ahead.
Yes, the concern is that we could have the density changed with nobody knowing it. And I actually want to give some kudos here to the planning department, because like Sean just pointed out, this really came down to Holly Summers' letter that, expressed a concern, and the commission was listening to that. And I listened to the recording of it, and my name was mentioned, and Commissioner Skinner said, I can't believe that people like Quincy and Jennifer are not interested in this. And so the process, it was a close call. It was a very close call. It was literally one voice, but that one voice did result in, the process going the way it should. And I just want to give you guys some kudos for having this meeting, this Zoom meeting, which, is accessible to us. And I anticipate that there will probably be several more of these, and that this is going to be an inclusionary process. And I just want to thank the Gallatin County Planning Department for being open to the fact that, it might not be a perfect process of notification, but when you do get feedback, you guys are listening. And I just want to say thank you for that. And that's it.
Thank you. That's very nice. Oh, we got a nice additional comment from Tim and Penny Roberts. Agree with Quincy to thanking you for having this meeting. We got some additional comments that came in, one from Matthew McCalla. I have to leave because I was not given adequate notice of this meeting. I would like to delay further discussion on these changes for 3 to 6 months. Many more people couldn't be here tonight and would like to weigh in. I guess if Matthew is still on, or to those of you that are sort of feeling similarly like you're catching up to this process, we are going to have a public hearing and before the Planning and Zoning Commission on May 13th, and you can either Zoom into that or attend in person, and we strongly encourage you to attend that meeting and participate. The discussion is continuing there. So that's your next opportunity, and it's on the calendar.
Catherine, could I ask, I heard a rumor that there might not be a quorum for the commission that day, for the committee, planning and zoning, on May 13th. How sure are you that they will have time to be addressing the Bozeman Pass on that day? I guess, because if we're going to rally the troops to be there, I guess I'd want to make sure that people can be there, especially because it's during business hours.
Great, I appreciate that. Oh, go ahead, Sean.
There will be a quorum. What was at issue was we weren't sure. We were going to have at least 5 Planning and Zoning Commission members there, but I wasn't sure that we were going to have at least 2 county commissioners. And I got confirmation this afternoon that there will be at least 2 county commissioners at that meeting.
Excellent.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I see the only other question that we had come in, we had 2 questions related to grandfathered uses and structures, aka non-conforming lots, uses and structures in planning department parlance. Matt asked, I don't have the community guide in front of me, but is there anything proposed that would impact grandfathered structures or uses? If so, that's a significant issue besides notice and land use that we should discuss further. And so yeah, if for any of you who have the community guide pulled up, that had been in, or that is currently in section 4 of the Bozeman Pass zoning regulation, and the proposed changes basically delete all of that from that section because all of that content exists in the part 1 zoning administrative regulation in section 5. And so there is a big section there that covers non-conforming lots, uses, and structures. And the planning department recognizes these are important and probably also an important part of Gallatin County's heritage, right? A lot of our non-conforming structures are, you know, potentially like iconic barns maybe, or some such, right? So we want to make sure we have really clear provisions for how to, you know, address them. So those are in section 5 of the administrative regulation. They weren't just entirely deleted. And then we had another comment from Tim and Penny. There are many deletions in the whole Bozeman Pass zoning regulations. However, and I think I read this aloud, but I'm reading it again. However, some of old section 4 on pages 28 through 31 have been deleted. This includes rules on variances, amendments, complaints, and enforcement. Why have these been deleted, and where have they been moved to, or where have they all, or were they all completely deleted? And this is a great question. All of those provisions have been moved over, or exist, I should say, in the part 1 zoning administrative regulation. That's like one of the core purposes of that regulation is to standardize all the sort of processes for complaints, for variances, for CUPs. If you remember in the very beginning, I mentioned how, you know, the noticing requirements for conditional use permits vary between Bozeman Pass and Bridger Canyon, for example, two citizen initiated districts. And the intent here is just to say the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Planning Department and members of the public can't track all of that. And it leads to lots of procedural errors, or it leads to some procedural errors and a lot of confusion. And so the goal is for all of our citizen initiated districts, they're going to have their unique intents and purposes and development patterns. And they're just going to have a standard way that we process.
That BS needs to be called out on. The mission is to make more money.
Okay, so it sounds like somebody had a comment there. Do you want to share any more? It sounds like there is some skepticism about the actual intent of this. I think that's what I was hearing, and that the actual intent is to make more money for the county. Is that what I'm hearing? Okay. Do you want to, whoever said that, do you want to share anything else about that? Okay. All right. Thank you. So did that address your question, Tim and Penny, about sort of where all of these administrative provisions that had previously been in section 4, or that are currently in section 4 of the Bozeman Pass zoning regulations, went in the proposed amendments? Yes. Okay, great. Excellent. So I think we have touched on all of the other questions that I've seen appear in the chat. Please speak up if we've missed something. And that leaves us with our two big topics for our last 35 minutes of the meeting, noticing and land use permits. I don't know which one we want to start with. I honestly feel like noticing is one that maybe people feel more strongly about, and we should start with, and then we can get to land use permits. Does anybody disagree with this strategy? All right, I'm not hearing it. All right, let's talk a little bit about noticing. Sean, do you want to sort of recap where the planning department is with noticing and what we hope to achieve in our discussion with the Planning and Zoning Commission in June about that?
Sure. So there have been a couple ideas that have been proposed so far about noticing. One is for the county planning department to purchase some larger public notice signs. Sometimes you see these like driving around the city of Bozeman. I think it says like development action or something like that. And, you know, they're a 24 by 36 inch sign, something like that. And we would potentially install those around the zoning district when there is a proposed item that requires notice to be posted. So a little bit more visibility than putting fluorescent 8.5 by 11 sheets around the zoning district. A second idea that staff has had, and we haven't gotten the county attorney's input on this yet, but something that I think would be beneficial, even if it's not necessarily in the regulation, but for residents of the zoning district, of each zoning district, to identify locations in their district where when notice is required to be posted, that staff should be posting those notices. That we try and take our best shot at posting them in locations that, you know, residents might frequent. I would say probably of all of our zoning districts, Bozeman Pass is probably about the most difficult to do that in because it's such a large district and the population is so distributed across the land there. You know, there's not one or two key locations that most people drive by. So getting some idea from residents about those key locations for posting in their own districts would really help us be successful as well. But in general, we adhere to statute. Someone put a comment in the chat earlier about, you know, expecting us to follow the planning department social media feed is a joke, and I totally agree. The planning department hardly has a social media presence for that reason. The county, though, does have a social media presence, and so things that we think really need to get out there, we rely on the county's social media, not the planning department's feed. We rely on posting locations in districts, posting notices. We rely on, we're required to by law, publish notice in the newspaper. But I know in many parts of the county, the newspaper isn't even delivered and readership is low, and posting it's, you know, hit or miss. So we are certainly wanting to hear from the public other ideas for how we can be more effective at noticing. You know, someone has put in here about, you know, sending notice to all the residents of a district via first class mail. That's probably not going to happen. That's probably cost prohibitive, to be honest, for us to do that across the board. But we're certainly open to suggestions and having that discussion with the Planning and Zoning Commission and figuring out what is feasible and desirable.
Sean, I actually have a question for you about that. When can citizen-initiated districts form zoning advisory committees?
Right now, I'm trying to remember if Bozeman Pass has a provision in their existing regulation for a citizens advisory committee. If it doesn't,
We do it. We do have it in there, but we believe it was redlined out.
it was redlined out, I think, because that's now included in the administrative regulations. The administrative regulations set it up so that any district can form a citizens advisory committee. And a citizens advisory committee is, I think, a great idea. It's another venue for citizens to show up, to comment on a proposed conditional use permit or variance or text amendments. You know, they're meeting at a time that's generally different than when the Planning and Zoning Commission or County Commission meet. So it's just another opportunity for input.
Great. There have been a couple of comments that have come. Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I think, this is Nona. I'm really kind of astounded. I mean, you can see the interest just from today, and that so many districts have already approved this administrative zoning regulation. I just feel like it would be a very big red flag. I think you can't say that people aren't interested. I really think the reason that you have not gotten much more feedback, perhaps from all of these other districts as well, is because people don't understand what's happening and aren't aware of it. It's not that they're not interested. I think they just don't know about it. And I think we have to move past I mean, we all live in a different world with Zoom and email and other ways of communicating. And I think there has to be some changes that bring us into the current way people communicate.
Yeah, and I think that's
I would like,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Jennifer.
I would like to add, this is Jennifer, and I think that the 3 out of the 15 101 zoning districts participated in the process of creating the administrative regulation. And I think that this wasn't a failure in transparency or the planning department not wanting to have us involved, but it's a failure in the process of notification. And I think that bigger signs that potentially are a sort of a blight on the landscape are not a reasonable solution. I feel as though statute was followed in the process in the creation of this administrative regulation. I was really surprised when I found that this regulation had been started in 2018 and continued all through 2019. I had never heard of a word of it. And so I think it's not just me, but I think that all of us that are landowners in these 15 districts needed to be part of that process. And it's water, that's kind of under the bridge now, but I would love to see either a countywide email list of all zoning district landowners, so that there could be a dialogue, or even sending out a postcard when there are important initiatives and regulations and amendments going on that many of us would be very interested in participating in, and we just don't hear about them.
Mm-hmm.
Your recommendation about email is something I didn't mention that we're also talking about, and I forgot to mention it, is kind of an opt-in list where residents can say, hey, I want to get email notification of any amendments to the subdivision regulations or the Bozeman Pass zoning regulations, et cetera. It has to be somewhat targeted. We're not going to send out, every conditional use permit application that comes in Bozeman Pass. Those are already available online on the Planning and Zoning Commission agendas, et cetera. But if a amendment is proposed to a specific regulation, we would send out that information to that email list. And that's something I think would be really helpful for us and for residents.
Yeah.
I'd like to second Nona's comments, but also would you say once again, when is this notification issue on the agenda for the Planning Commission and the county commissioners?
Great question. That's on their June meeting. I don't have my calendar in front of me. It's the second Thursday, right, Sean?
No, it's not in June. It's moved back because of the county's budget hearings.
Oh.
It is, I believe, June 17th.
Gotcha.
Okay, and that'll be a public hearing, right?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, and I have to leave this meeting, but I'd just like to make one last comment. And just a suggestion. There were comments made very early on about, singling out marijuana use, or not use, but production, growth, or things. I'm not going to make any comments one way politically or the other, but I would suggest, and following on what Quincy said, that you go back to the county commissioner and find a better way to describe or characterize what you're trying to do. Your description in the last page here, that while it's emotional, is not going to hang up or hold up in court. And you're just asking yourselves to spend a lot of our taxpayer money. So I just suggest you go back and look at that issue.
Great, thank you for that. So it sounds like that is an issue to bring back to the commission and say, hey, it sounds like we're hearing from people that this needs some further consideration. Oh, and I just want to reiterate what you said. You also wanted to second some of Nona's comments about, sort of bringing us into the 21st century with regard to notice and email and that kind of thing. Did I get that right?
That is correct.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Ways to do it technology-wise that are not going to cost first-class mail.
Right.
You all find us for taxes. You can certainly find us for something as important as this.
Yeah. Would, Sean mentioned that sort of opt-in email list that would notify folks for zone text amendments or zone map amendments. Does that sound like something that of interest to folks right now?
Yeah, I think major issues should be notified to more than just signs up in a district.
Great.
Today it can be done.
Great. Let's see, I'm going to take a look at the comments in the chat. Let's see, Quincy, yes to email notice, also text. An opt-in list is a great idea. I would appreciate email notification. Tim and Penny Roberts proposed having boards at the beginnings of all of the canyons, such as Kelly, Bear, Moffett, Jackson Creek, where everyone drives by, because they say that their parents don't use email. And so, having some sort of physical notice would be helpful.
Just to be clear, if we go to an email type notice, we still have to comply with the minimum requirements of state law for posting notice.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be a combination.
Great. Let's see, other ideas that folks want to share for improving notice. Does anybody have ideas for, how we can better comply with the requirement to post notice? Does anybody have any ideas related to the one that Tim and Penny Roberts shared about, posting notice at the beginnings of the canyons? Do folks think that could be helpful, or are there other ideas of locations or sizes that would be acceptable? I know Jennifer voiced a concern about, bigger signs being a blight on the landscape. What would work for folks in this situation? It looks like Melanie chimed in. Notice boards are also a great idea, at least 24 inches by 36 inches. Also ask individual subdivision to maintain notice to all members. So through their HOA, I think is what Melanie is suggesting. Looks like Quincy has his hand up. Quincy, go ahead.
Well, I wrote some things in the chat there. The county already has an emergency service notice, which I subscribe to, and it works by text. I don't know if such a thing is prohibitive in cost, but it does have the advantage that text I usually get frankly, emails, yeah, I get them, I guess. Maybe a few too many of them. The problem is not getting them. The problem is opening them. And the other thing is, this is kind of like this dialogue that's happening, and I just had this idea, which is maybe if there was a solar charged small notice and it sat near the stop signs, because it's when somebody stopped, that's when they're going to have more of a chance to safely notice that something's going on. And like Penny said, if it's at the mouths of the canyons where everybody feeds into either into Bozeman or Livingston, but almost all of us to Bozeman, if there was something and it just said, public hearing notice, check the website or something like that. You know, you don't have to give all the details, just give people a heads up. And then we can go to the county website and we can get all of the details. It just throwing it out there. I don't even know if it's technologically possible. That's all.
Great, that's helpful. Thanks, Quincy.
So when Quincy raises the pirate flag on his property, everyone will check the county website.
Right, right. I think, this is such a big process and maybe I missed it, but I wonder if having someone write an article for the newspaper about this whole zoning regulation would have been helpful. And maybe it did happen and I missed it, but an actual article encouraging people or an advertisement that you would take out in the paper and not just something in the little legal section would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Says that we're not muted.
Okay, great. I'm just writing that down. Thank you, Nona. So having somebody, write an article in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle saying, hey, we're proposing to create these Part 1 administrative regulations and we're initiating this process now, get involved, that kind of thing. Does that capture it?
Exactly.
We probably got a laugh on it.
I did.
Let's see. Quincy said, I wrote a letter and they never published it. And Tim and Penny Roberts say paper is okay, but so many people no longer use the paper. So yeah, I mean, this is a really tricky issue. I wanted to ask the group about a zoning advisory committee. Is that something that's of interest to you all?
Yes.
Yes. This is Jennifer and Nona.
Thank you. All right, I heard 2 yeses. Anybody else who thinks that might be helpful in getting the word out? Word of mouth seems fairly effective. Tim and Penny Roberts say possibly. I see Quincy with his thumb up. I'm going to look through. I think a zoning advisory committee is inevitable, says Quincy. Yes, from somebody via their iPhone. Jonathan, yes, but not the only way. Matthew says advisory committee would be great. I think we can also have reps reach out to neighbors, et cetera, to gain involvement. Anne says yes. Maria Farner says yes. Okay, so I'm hearing some strong support for, considering the creation of a zoning advisory committee for Bozeman Pass, and also interest in 2 other additional sort of complementary options, which are, determining locations where we have to post notice, potentially at the mouths of canyons, and having this opt-in email list. So those are sort of the 3 strategies that I'm hearing a lot of the most support for right now. Does that sound right to anybody? Or does that sound not right to some people? Am I missing something? Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Thank you all for staying so engaged, by the way. This is a long technical meeting. Okay, great. Sounds right. Awesome. Okay, well, these are some excellent concrete suggestions, so thank you for this. Let's see, Matt Peterson says, for those of us that need to leave but are interested in listening to the rest of the call, especially regarding the May 13th meeting, where can we find the recording of the call? I will have this video recording and I will share it in my follow-up email to about this meeting. If you want to be included in that follow-up email, thank you for the reminder, Matt, put your email address in the chat right now. Unless you've already received an email from me, in which case I already have your email. But if you have not yet received an email to me, please go ahead and put your email address in the chat so that you can get this follow-up. Okay, excellent. Oh, I think I saw a question from somebody earlier that has long since been passed in the chat, but I wanted to make sure to address it. They had a question about whether the zoning district boundaries were changing. The zoning district boundaries are not, no changes have been proposed to the zoning district boundaries. So just to be really clear about that. Okay. Great. I'm seeing a lot of emails. Thank you all. I really appreciate it. I think the other, do we want to keep talking about noticing, or shall we transition for our last 15 minutes or so to land use permits? Because yeah, we will definitely be able to address everything related to land use permits in 15 minutes. Okay, yes, please. I think folks are ready to talk about land use permits. Okay, so I think we left it off with lots of questions about grandfathered structures, with questions about exemptions for certain structures of a certain size. People had questions about whether this is just a money-making scheme for the county. Where should we start? I guess potentially I could take a poll, or I could say what are the group's current sort of concerns that they want to address that haven't been addressed yet related to land use permits? What haven't we talked about land use permits, or what needs more discussion? Quincy, I see your hand up.
Yes, I just don't even think that this whole conversation belongs in this, because this is not an administrative change. This is an intent change of this. And, you know, the best thing would be if you guys would just drop the whole idea, because it just doesn't belong in here. I mean, from a legal perspective, as well as, you know, this was, I think everybody is supportive of making administrative changes that help the planning department administer these zoning districts. And we all want to have wise use of our tax dollars. But honestly, this just seems like a big overreach, and I haven't, you know, I don't know what else to say. That's it.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to add to that? Sounds like you're just like this to you doesn't fit in conceptually with these other changes, which you feel like you're generally supportive of. And you just think that this doesn't really have a place in these proposed changes and doesn't comport with the intent of the district. Did I get that right? Yeah, okay. I'm seeing
Catherine.
Oh, go ahead.
This is Jonathan. Since I'm kind of a techno weenie, how do we sort of pre-screen whether or not we have to put in for a land permit? I mean, do we send the permit in and then you go, yeah, you need one or don't need one? Or do I have to interpret the regulation and just say, okay, I don't believe I need one, so I'm not going to put a permit in there? Who gets to decide that? Or is the intent really that we would have to put in a full permit for you guys to decide whether or not we need a permit or not? That's my question.
Yeah. Sounds like you're just wondering, like, how would I even know whether I need a permit or not?
Well, because I don't want to go to the full effort to fill out a whole permit just for you to say we don't need it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And probably the easiest way to find that out is to call the planning department. You can just call our office and say, hey, I'm wondering whether I need a permit for this. Can you tell me what the regulation says? And folks do that all the time. And that's part of what we're here for. Did that?
Yeah. We also, because believe it or not, there's people that are skeptical when we tell them they don't need a permit for something and want something official from us. We have a little form you can fill out called a property information form as well. And you would fill out basically your contact information and, you know, the identifying information for your property. And, you know, you can say, hey, I'm going to build this on my property. Do I need a permit? And we would respond, you know, yes or no. And if we say no, you have a record of that response then. So if down the road anything changes, you have record of asking that question and documentation that we said no. So there's a couple
And
different ways.
how tolerant are you when somebody calls in? Like if I just say, I'm going to put a carport on my garage, how tolerant are you of like, well, okay, I need to know more information, therefore put in a permit. You know what I mean? Or if just a verbal description is good enough for that kind of response, because my worry would be that you would go, well, I don't have enough information, therefore put in a permit and we'll tell you if it's good or not. Unless there's a list out there that just says carport, no, don't need it.
We don't
This
generally, we don't generally have people apply for a land use permit application to decide whether one is necessary. If we don't have enough information and it's questionable, we would generally say, hey, why don't you fill out one of those property information forms? We can research whatever we need to research and get back to you in writing.
Okay, thank you.
But generally it's pretty rare where we have to even go to that extent. It's usually able to be resolved with a phone call.
Okay, so as long as we can sort of document that so that I can go in or go off in good faith and know that I'm not going to get nabbed later. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
If you can clearly tell us where your property is and we can find it on the map and clearly describe what you're wanting to do, we can generally resolve it with a phone call.
Okay, very good. And that's no cost, right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
All right, so I'm seeing a lot of comments on chat and I really want to make sure that we address them because they're important. And I want to thank Matt Peterson for asking, you know, are we able to respond to Quincy's question about why land use permits are included in these proposed updates and why they're not considered an overreach, and some other folks chimed in with some additional nuance to that question saying, why is this within the scope of the administrative changes and the standardization of zoning regulations? I think a huge part of purchasing property and deciding to be in this district for many of us was the freedom of use. In many areas, the HOAs and CCNRs also control these activities and control construction very well. And we have some other folks chiming in to say they agree. Someone else said, I have experience with land use permits and it takes time and money. So these are great questions. Let's dive right in. Why are these included in the administrative regulation and proposed in these updates? And I'm gonna hand this one to Sean first. And
so why is it included in the administrative regulation update? Most of our zoning regulations have land use permits. Bozeman Pass and the North Gallatin Canyon zoning district, which is not a Part 1 district, which is, and it's solely focused on sign regulation, are the only two that don't have land use permits. And that's okay. In the Bozeman Pass district, that was a conscious effort. Again, as I said earlier, you know, quite a bit of time has passed since this district was created. The county looks different today than it did in the mid 2000s. And it's time to have a conversation about it again. Is this something that makes sense in the district now or does it not? What are land use permits and why do we have them? Why are they included? You know, the zoning district has uses that are allowed. It has standards that go along with those uses. There've been a lot of conversations or questions about density tonight. You know, you're allowed to build a single family residence in the Bozeman Pass district right now without a land use permit. And there's some provisions for, accessory dwellings and things like that. Right now, no one's going out and checking to see, do they already have an existing single family dwelling and accessory dwelling units? And, when someone's wanting to build more. So I can't tell you that the density requirements and the regulation are really being administered or
Insurance
enforced
companies send me a letter saying they're coming out to take pictures.
unless
The
someone
county
is.
does it all the time.
Yep. All right. So someone's not muted right now, and I'm picking up some background noise. The county doesn't go out and regularly take pictures of people's property. That's not something we do. The GIS office does go out and when people have applied for an address, there is a component where they go back out sort of during the mapping season, which is usually the summer, and map structures associated with that address so that the fire department can find you if you call 911 or the EMTs. But that's not the county planning department, and that addressing information isn't related really to enforcement or administration of the regulation. So the land use permits are a way to verify that the requirements of the regulation are being adhered to. And it's really about upholding what you all decided was the purpose of the regulation and the rules. And if residents of the district, still don't want land use permits, that can be communicated to the Planning and Zoning Commission, and that's okay. You just have to understand, it's a trade-off in terms of what the planning department, can and can't do in administering your regulation. And as I said before, this is a dialogue. It's a question that's being posed. No one is mandating that land use permits be required in Bozeman Pass.
All right. So we had a couple more comments in, and before I read those out, I just want to sort of reiterate something that Sean said that I thought was important and relates to a common concern that you all expressed on the chat this evening and that we talked about, which is density and increasing density. And Sean points out that land use permits are sort of one of the ways that we, confirm that people are complying with the density limits in their district. And it sounds like that's really important in Bozeman Pass. And again, like Sean said, this is a conversation. And if you all feel like land use permits are not appropriate, that can certainly be communicated to the Planning and Zoning Commission. And I just wanted to emphasize that point because I did hear you all express concerns about density. So I just wanted to point that out. But I want to also read the comments that have come in on the chat. So Tim and Penny Roberts, well, you say they don't check, but we've had in years past people show up with a roof we put over a trailer many years ago that they took from pictures taken overhead. So there is a way someone is checking. Interesting.
That's likely the Department of Revenue. So those are the people that assess the property and structures values for property tax purposes. That's not the county. That's a division of the state.
Does that answer your question, Tim and Penny? Maybe. Let's see. It looks like Melanie had to depart. Someone just asked, do we need more regulation? And yeah, that's sort of the question at hand with these land use permits. Matt Peterson had a very nice thing to say, so thank you for that. Let's see, other questions and comments about land use. Are you, I think
I just had,
go ahead.
Sorry, I had just a question about you mentioning the density related to the land use permits. Are you aware of anyone in our district that has attempted to build outside of what has been allowed to change the density? Are you aware of any situations that have occurred in that regard?
I'm not specifically aware, but that's an example of the things that we're not checking right now as development does occur. Without that, I mean, the land use permit process it's a zoning compliance permit. Does the use or structure that's being proposed comply with the established requirements of the regulation? So it's possible. I'm not going to say it's highly likely or that it's happened for sure, but it's very possible that could have happened.
Thank you.
Other questions? I'm looking through this, looking at all of your faces. People have sort of contemplative expression.
I'm Hal Madsen. I'd like to make a few comments.
Yeah.
Okay. So we live up Kelly Canyon. Okay. Beautiful area. We moved here about 10 years ago. It's a very low density area. My understanding is it takes about 40 acres to put a home on in here. So we've had very few homes. We are not like the valley. I understand your problems in the valley with your tremendous boom. Okay, but up here in the mountain country, we don't grow near as fast, and part of it is because of our geography and our density. We've only had 4 new homes here on the south side of the pass in the 8 years we've lived here. That I know of, we've had 2 on the other side of the pass. Okay, and so because of this low density, I'm opposed to this proposed zoning regulation amendment. And I would say to you, the citizens have done a beautiful job here in Kelly Canyon, Jackson Creek, Bridger, the greater area. It's a beautiful area where people like to drive, ride their bicycles. We love having them go by. We became aware of this on the 17th or 18th. Thank you, Nona, Quincy, and Jennifer, or we'd have never known about it. We're very concerned about it, okay? I consider this an overreach. In my career, I worked with the planning department for about 50 years, okay? And fellow citizens, I want you to know, I consider this just the beginning. My experience with planning departments is that they just continue. So, Sean and Catherine, I'm not blaming you. It's the nature of the beast, okay? It's what I've experienced, okay? I've talked to multiple neighbors in the last week since I became aware, and I have not found a neighbor yet that is wanting this, okay? They're against conditional use permits, land use permits. Costs money, takes time, okay? And it looks like in this greater area, there's just not a big need for it. This is a whole nother animal than down where you guys are working down there. I get it down in the valley. I get where, I don't even know how you have time to talk to us, okay, with what you have going down there, okay? So we have very little new development. And Sean, like you said, you don't know of anybody that broke the regs. I'm not saying somebody didn't, but I'm saying it's very minimal. So why would we need the additional regulations, okay? It sounds like a waste of your time to me. I know you got many things going, okay? So just recapping, I'd say this, we have low density. The citizens have done a beautiful job. There's little new development, okay? And we've had nobody asked for a conditional use permit for mining, Sean said, in the last 15 years. What I'm saying is I don't see the need, okay? Because of our geography and the way our density and everything else, okay? So I'd say to the fellow citizens, folks, I encourage you that we look into this thoroughly. And if we don't think it fits us, then let's stand up and let's get united, because we haven't had a chance to do that because we haven't been aware. Let's pursue legal counsel and let's stop this overreach. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that comment. So it sounds like just to summarize, we feel like the existing regulation is, working as intended, and folks are complying with the low density standards. And so no sort of additional measures are necessary. I did hear you say that you don't need conditional use permits, and I just wanted to address that, because actually conditional use permits are, exist in the current incarnation of the Bozeman Pass zoning regulation. So, there are identified conditional uses, and you have to apply to receive a conditional use permit with the existing regulation. There are natural resources conditional use permits, which we propose to, continue if any of these proposed amendments are, adopted. So I just wanted to clarify that, conditional use permits are currently part of the regulation and not something that would be new.
I also wanted to clarify something that was said. Nona asked me specifically if I knew about violations related to density, and I said no to that. I don't. I am aware of other zoning violations that have taken place in Bozeman Pass and been involved in trying to remedy those. So yes, there have been other zoning violations, but not specific to the density requirement that I'm aware of.
All right, and we had a lot of comments come in on chat, and so I want to give voice to those so that everybody can be sure to have heard them. So let me back up a little bit. So Jonathan said, I agree with some level of enforcement by the county. I don't want to rely entirely on neighborhood enforcement or quote unquote snitching. Laura Stackhouse then said, given the explosion of development in Bozeman, seems like only a matter of time before someone would take advantage of the Bozeman Pass for not having any permitting requirement. I'd support the requirement of permits to ensure no development that violates the Bozeman Pass regulations happens. And then a thank you. Somebody else then said, correct me if I am wrong, we have regulation by the county in regards to density and quantity of dwelling per parcel. That is correct. That is in your current iteration of the zoning regulations. So that is specified in there. We just don't have sort of the strongest mechanism for tracking and enforcing that, which is land use permits. Anne said, I worry that pressure in the valley will cause more building in our outlying areas. Some form of regulation is needed. Okay, I'm just going to keep reading through these comments. They keep coming in. We have regulation. We are all required by Montana Department of Environmental Quality and the county to obtain permits for septic, electrical work, and plumbing. There is no need for this outreach. Jonathan says, again, agree that times are changing and new pressures are coming. Out-of-staters may not be in line with our values. And then somebody else said, thank you. So it sounds like there is sort of at least from hearing folks on the chat and hearing some comments that folks have made, there are varying perspectives on this issue of whether land use permits would be helpful in this situation. I don't expect that we are necessarily going to get to the bottom of it this evening. I would recommend that this conversation sort of continues among you all, and this is also a conversation we can continue at the May 13th Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. I do see some hands up, and I do want to make sure those folks have a chance to weigh in, but I also want to respect everybody's time. It's now 7:40, and some of you are probably getting hungry or have other members of your family who are getting hungry or need to go to bed. So I just want to say maybe now is a good time to start closing things out after we get some sort of final comments in. So I see Nona and Jennifer have their hand up. Matthew McCalla has his hand up. Tim and Penny Roberts put another question into the chat, and then there was one more question in the chat as well that we will address. So let's go in that order, and if I miss somebody, I'll keep looking and I'll come back to you. So Nona and Jennifer, what was your question?
This is Jennifer, and I've been trying to compare what has been taken out of the Bozeman Pass regulation and put into the Part 1 zoning administrative regulation. And I'm having a really hard time. So I also put your the references that you made in the community meeting announcement. And I think that I, for one, need to have a better understanding and confidence that things that have been taken out of the original regulation in the red line, that those are someplace and that they continue to express our intent and honor the Bozeman Pass regulation.
Great. That is completely understandable. And if there are any specific aspects of that I can help highlight, please let me know. I know sort of criteria for the approval of variances and conditional use permits can be really important. So those are things we can talk about. Were there specific?
Well, and I think
just sort of the general need to digest this more.
I also think that it would be useful to have a graph that expresses, that compares the numerical references in the Bozeman Pass regulation to the numerical references in the administrative regulation. Understanding, of course, your huge task in putting the administrative regulation together and then trying to go back and make it fit with all of the other the specific zone regulations. I think sometimes, again, I think that you've done a great job. You and Sean have a huge job in dealing with the planning issues of Gallatin County, but I think sometimes one size does not fit all. And one other concern that I have is, is this top-down zoning? And is there a possibility that this is going to erode some of the strengths that the current Bozeman Pass regulation has been able to guide growth in our Bozeman Pass area?
Mhm.
And I think those would be unwittingly. I feel that we need to, or I need to spend time and digest it and make sure that we're not compromising the intent and the strength of regulation that we already have. Thank you so much, both of you.
If I can address a couple of those points, Jennifer. For Spring Hill District, we created a table that kind of showed where content was in the existing regulation and where that same content could be found now, whether it was in another section of the district regulation or if it was in the administrative regulation. We could go through and do something like that for Bozeman Pass as well, if that would be helpful.
That would be very helpful.
And to your second point, or the other point that I wanted to address about whether this is top-down zoning or not, I sure hope it's not. In my opinion, zoning is, it was a partnership. The citizens of Bozeman Pass got together and said, you know, we're willing to support zoning to protect our interests in the property. And the county's role in that partnership is the administration of those regulations after they were adopted. And the amendments that are being proposed right now are very much focused on the administrative portion of it, how we deal with conditional use permits, how we deal with variances, what are the procedural requirements, making sure that those standards are clear and defensible and that the process is clearly outlined and consistent, so that we don't find ourselves in legal trouble in carrying out the regulation. So The land use permit discussion is certainly something that's more of a substantive change. We recognize that. We went to additional extent of having the Planning and Zoning Commission call that out specifically with a separate resolution of intention. And I understand that's the impetus for a lot of the discussion tonight, and that's just fine. I'm glad to have this discussion.
Thank you.
Just
Yeah,
to piggyback on that, for a second, I think that I really appreciated a couple of examples that both Catherine and Sean gave tonight as we were talking about what the experiences of other zoning districts has been and what some of the negotiated changes to the proposed regulation have been for each of those districts. I appreciate the possibility that that can happen. And I appreciate the fact that there may be some things that we have not thought of that some of the other districts have. And I would hope that you could continue to enlighten us about some good ideas that those other districts have made when they have proposed changes.
Sure. Yeah, I think just to tag on here, I wanted to thank everybody for participating, and Sean and Catherine, obviously, for kind of initiating this discussion. I think a lot of us kind of feel like we're joining this maybe a little bit late. Just to clarify too, this is Joel Daub. I'm on Matt's computer because we're good buddies, so we just tag teamed on this. But you know, I think I came into the meeting kind of thinking one thing, and I would just challenge people. You know, I think I am very leery of the regulation changing as far as the use, but I think Laura's comments that you'd read kind of resonated with me. And I just don't know the best way to go about safeguarding what we have now, understanding that it's worked for 30 or 40 years really very well. I do worry that without a proper enforcement mechanism, other than our neighborly good feelings towards one another, that it could be taken advantage of. And so I'm really kind of on the fence. And I think there's a lot more discussion that probably has to happen around this. If there could be some negotiated changes around the land use permits, or, you know, I'm really in favor of a mechanism that would prevent density or change, you know, what we have here. And where I am, I'm in Eagle Rock, and our HOA is just super restrictive. And so I've always just assumed that would be what would backstop any changes there. You know, I worry if that review process or enforcement isn't there or changes somehow, that someone could just kind of come in that's new to the community and say, I don't really care about what you guys have now, and try to expand what's happening west of town here. And I know that's a concern for many of my neighbors as well. And so I just look forward to the discussion and trying to figure out some way that we can feel safe moving forward in this new landscape of kind of the new West that we're experiencing so much here, as well as feeling like we're not giving up rights that we have right now. I don't know if that's possible or not. I'm kind of new to this idea, but that would be something I just challenge everybody to remain open to, is if there's a way to make ourselves safer that does come with some regulation, maybe that's worth the exchange, if we can make it in a way that makes sense to us and makes sense with what we want here.
Thanks, Joel. Sorry, I've been calling you Matt this entire time.
That's okay. No, that's okay.
Oh, looks like Sean has brought up the comparison that he created. Sounds like from folks on the chat, this would be really useful. Here's an example of what it looks like. Sean, do you want to highlight anything?
Yeah, just going to say exactly what you said. This is an example so that you all have an idea of what to expect. The left-hand column just shows the location of content in the Spring Hill, the existing regulation, and then where we moved that content to. So there's references to the zoning regulation or the Part 1 administrative regulation. So just wanted to give you guys give you all an idea of what you might be seeing when we develop this.
Great. And there are a couple more questions in the chat that I think will be important to address before we close out here. Tim and Penny were wondering if you need to have your questions or comments in a week before the May 13th Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. You do not. If you submit them a week before, I think that gives sufficient time for them to be incorporated into the staff report. But any comment that we get from the public leading up to the morning of the meeting, and sometimes during the meeting, we will share with the Planning and Zoning Commission and hand out during that meeting. And you can also participate in the meeting too. So like I said, via Zoom, that information I'll send out in a follow-up email to today. Or you can show up at the county courthouse, 311 West Main in Bozeman, and participate in person. So don't worry, you don't have to have everything outlined a week before. And then there was another question, is this correct? We have regulation. We are all required by Montana Department of Environmental Quality and the county to obtain permits for septic, electrical work, and plumbing. Not entirely. So it's the Gallatin City County Environmental Health Department that would issue a septic permit. As for electrical work and plumbing, there's no building department in the county. So we do not look at that at all. I mean, if you're building there are certain structures and uses that meet the threshold for review by the Montana Building Codes Department. But that's not something that we do. And those are typically for, commercial uses, that kinds of thing. Sean, do you have anything to add about
that? Yeah, for the building permit, it's definitely multifamily residential and commercial uses that require the building permit from the state, but they do require electrical and plumbing for even smaller projects and structures. So the state does have some review currently. But they're not looking at your zoning regulations and whether or not something complies with that. They're looking at whether it complies with electrical code, plumbing code, or building code.
All right, thank you, Tim and Penny, for that nice commendation. Let's see. Somebody made another comment. Strict regulations exist already against subdivision dividing the 148 plus timberline parcels. I'm not familiar with those parcels specifically, but Gallatin County does have subdivision regulations that apply in Bozeman Pass. And there are, I think, specific provisions for subdivisions in the existing Bozeman Pass regulation, if I'm remembering correctly.
I think that comment is basically saying it's an instance where maybe the covenants are more restrictive than the zoning regulation or impose additional restrictions. And as we discussed earlier, where you have multiple layers of requirements, landowners are responsible for adhering to the most stringent requirement.
All right.
I'm wondering if you are aware, I'm wondering if you're aware of anything in the legislature that might affect our district.
There was a change through two bills, House Bill 498 and House Bill 527. They impacted the ability to regulate mining and recovery of a mineral, essentially. But I think the Bozeman Pass regulations are pretty consistent with the requirements. It basically says we can't prevent the complete use, development, or recovery of a mineral. And the Bozeman Pass district has a conditional use permit process rather than an outright prohibition on stuff. So I think in some way, shape, or form, that was on our minds when this district was created, years ago. So there have been lots of planning related bills that limit local discretion and local control this session, but I don't think there's anything that specifically is detrimental to the Bozeman Pass district.
Thank you.
All right, and we had one more comment come in via chat about how to share public comments. in advance of the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. If we send in comments before the meeting, should we also plan to be at the meeting to voice the same concerns? That is up to you. We will have shared your comments directly with the Planning and Zoning Commission, and we typically summarize what we hear in those comments during those meetings. So your comments will go directly to the Planning and Zoning Commission members, and they typically receive a summary from us. And also, if you would like to participate, you may as well. All right, I am not seeing any further comments or questions coming in. Maybe some people are in fact ready for dinner. Any final thoughts? Well,
I just want to go on record saying I've been jealous of Zach sitting out in the sun this whole time. He just turned his camera off right as I said it.
That's looked very nice.
Oh, he moved inside.
Great. Well, I just wanted to, before we sign off, thank you all again. I feel like this has been a really productive meeting, and it's been really helpful hearing from all of you. And thank you all for just engaging so productively with us. And I really, really, truly appreciate it. Many of you have my email. Like I said earlier, if you want to receive a follow-up email to this meeting that includes information for the May 13th Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, reminds you of when the June meeting to discuss noticing requirements is, and includes some other information like the recording of this video. If you want to share it with other people, please put your email in the chat if you haven't already. If you don't have our email addresses yet, Sean just put them in the chat for you. They're pretty straightforward. It's our first names and last name, first name dot last name at gallatin.mt.gov. So sean.o'callahan@gallatin.md.gov or catherine.daly@gallatin.mt.gov. I think that's all I have. Sean, is there anything else that you would like to say before we sign off?
Just again, thank you all for participating. I know it's been a long meeting and everyone's ready to get on with their evening, but we do appreciate the conversation, and that's exactly what this is. This is a conversation, and we look forward to it continuing.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Great job, you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Quincy.
Thanks for participating, Quincy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say, I was a little miffed at first, but you've kind of turned my feelings around a little bit, and a lot of that is I think you guys are really well organized, and the way you handled this meeting, I thought it was very professional. So,
well, thank you, and sorry you were miffed, but
it's just
you never came across as being miffed, which I appreciate. And
I get miffed. That doesn't. I'm down here pretty much all the time, so maybe I come to here.
Well, thank you for your comments, and I know you have concerns about the land use permits, and we'll continue that discussion. It is a discussion.
And I have to say, the guide was really helpful to me. And when I read all 7 pages or 8 pages of it, I really came to a clearer understanding of what you're trying to do with this. And 99% of this, I'm 100% in support of. I think it's great. It actually improves the regulation. It's just the land use permits, and then you're going to get a letter from me. You already know that. Right? You're going to get a letter. I don't even have to say that, right? But I wanted to go to this meeting first, and this is something I didn't say earlier in the meeting. And it occurred to me, and I felt like I had already shared a lot. I didn't want to monopolize any more time. But the big thing with the agriculture is there's such a thing, even in 2021, as subsistence agriculture.
Mhm.
And this is a traditional use that has been in this Bozeman Pass since before Lewis and Clark ever got lost over here. And subsistence agriculture is important. There's no way anybody that is a traditional subsistence agriculturalist can meet the state definition of agriculture. It just isn't going to happen. They don't have receipts for whatever they sold, even if they did sell $1,500 worth of pickles or whatever. And this food freedom bill that has just passed in the legislature, that's going to encourage these small farmers to actually, will be able to sell. We will be able to sell our pickles in a way that we never were able to before. So, you know, I apologize for not thinking about that before. It'll be in my comments, but I just want to throw that out there.
Well, I think that's a good comment. I think the way we're thinking about it, and certainly chime in here, Catherine, with the direction that the Planning and Zoning Commission gave us, you know, it's basically deferring to the definition of agriculture that's in all of the district regulations. And then on the structure side, which is where we end up getting into these challenging conversations with people because the requirements just aren't clear. If we had the definition for agricultural structure in the administrative regulations, that just made it clear that an agricultural structure is a structure that's used primarily for agricultural purposes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we get away from that conversation with the person that, you know, builds a 3,000 square foot shop and has 100 feet of hay storage in it, trying to say it's an agricultural structure.
And the damn horses are always a problem. Are those actually agriculture or not? I speak as somebody that I love horses. I've owned them almost all my life. But they're a damn problem. I'll tell you, it's just everything about a horse is a problem. It's either a problem right now or it's a problem waiting to happen.
I didn't say the hay was for a horse.
But yeah, I mean, it seems to me like you're always going to have people that game the system. That's the way, that's human nature, you know, and I think it would be good. I think it would be wise to have a clear definition of what an agricultural structure is. We have a whole bunch of them on our property, but we're farmers. I mean, we've always been farmers and ranchers. And I mean, that's just what they are. Anybody who looks at them pretty clearly, you know. So, you know, I'm with you with that. I think that there's a lot of things that clarification will be helpful. And I think that by and large, you guys have done a good job of simplifying this. Where I disagree with you, and I don't know if we even completely disagree because maybe you agree with me, which is that if you're going to do this, this needs to be, what do they call that? A zone text amendment. And it needs to be properly noticed, and it's a whole different thing. If you start talking about changing the intent of the district, don't call that an administration. You're just going to bring trouble on yourself.
So just to be clear, the process we're going through is a zone text amendment.
Okay, maybe I misunderstand then.
Yeah, and I want to, if you're going to put that in your letter.
Okay, I appreciate that.
You're going to put that in your letter. Let's just make sure you understand that this is a zone text amendment.
I'm not a lawyer, but I feel like what you're doing cuts to the intent of this, and it's more of a structural change than an administrative change. And I don't think you guys really understood that. I mean, I don't believe that you did, because I think if you did, you probably wouldn't have done it this way. Or maybe you would have. Maybe I'm wrong, but you know.
No, I don't want to hide behind anything, Quincy. We understood that raising the issue of land use permits in Bozeman Pass was a significant issue. It wasn't just purely an administrative change, and that's why, you know, we did a resolution of intent when we first started working on this, and listed all 15 of the Part 1 districts. We realized that with the land use permit issue in Bozeman Pass, it wasn't merely administrative. So we went back and did a separate resolution of intent and recognized we needed to sort of elevate the status with Bozeman Pass. That's why, again, we sent out the letters to the people that were involved that we could find from the committee in the beginning. So I'm in agreement with you that it is different, and I think we all recognized that.
Yeah, this notice thing, we've got to figure out a good solution to it. I mean, this notice thing, this was all developed back in the days when people walked around or rode horses, and everything was moving a whole lot slower. And nobody can read an 8.5 by 11 from a car. You've got to get out and walk over and look at it. And before you can even do that, you got to notice it. And with all the traffic and everything, nobody sees that. And then the newspaper, it used to be everybody read the newspaper. I subscribed to the Bozeman Daily Chronicle for 36 years, but I don't anymore.
Well, that's why I'm so heartened by the discussion that we had today. You know, I heard 3 suggestions that were generally supported by the people who participated in today's meeting, like 3 concrete suggestions to bring before the Planning and Zoning Commission. So I think that's great.
Yeah, we'll work it out. I'm sure. I have confidence in you guys. I sure, you're going to give me a new thing to praise God for blessing me that I don't work for the planning department. I can only imagine the headaches you guys have looking out there in the valley. When I drive out and I can see the valley at night, I'm just like, hey, vey, man, how can you even begin to deal with this?
Well, I'll frame it this way. Having these discussions with you guys, this is the fun part of the job. This is, I think, what attracted all of us to being planners is working with communities and being involved in these discussions. And luckily, we're getting to do more of that these days than we have in recent years. So,
Well, technology, this whole Zoom thing, I mean, honestly, if I never went to another Zoom meeting, it would be too soon because I've been to plenty of them in the last years, as I'm sure you have too.
yeah.
But this is an example of how it's actually very inclusive. And I don't know, you've been doing this for a long time. Do you think people are more polite with this? I mean, I've seen some shouting matches at these public meetings where people show up and they've got all this anger that they're bringing about who knows what, but they direct it at you guys because you're the easy target or whatever. I thought this was very cordial.
I thought it was too. Trying to facilitate a meeting, I got a little concerned. I was happy that there was such great turnout and participation, but I got a little concerned about the size and how we're going to be able to manage it. So it works just fine. There's some pretty good tools through Zoom. We can make it so that people can't unmute themselves. The facilitator has to unmute them. Catherine has a much better handle on it than I do, but we can actually put people in breakout groups to have a discussion, and then you bring them all back together, and someone gets to report. It's actually a pretty cool way to do stuff. But I like meeting in person better.
Yeah, me too. Totally. Totally. But anyway, again, thank you guys very much. You're very professional. Great job.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Quincy.
I'm out of here.
All right.
All right.
Yeah.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Well, I'm going to stop recording.
All right.
Let's see. How do I do this?